The first thing he remembers is the sound, not the television, not the voices, the sound of the glass in his hand cracking. It was a quiet evening in September 2008, the kind of evening that felt ordinary until history decided otherwise. The apartment smelled of leftover dinner and cheap cologne. The city lights outside blinked like they always did. Inside, a man in his mid-30s sat on a worn couch, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, watching the numbers on the screen collapse in real time. Red. Everywhere. Markets plunging, banks failing. Words like liquidity crisis and systemic collapse flashing at the bottom of the screen. And then his phone rang. Once, twice, three times, each call shorter than the last. Each voice more panicked. Each promise of stability replaced by uncertainty. And finally, a sentence that didn't feel real until it settled into his bones. We're shutting down. Your position is terminated. Effective immediately, he didn't scream. He didn't throw the phone. He just sat there, holding a glass of water so tightly it fractured in his grip. A thin line of blood slid down his palm. He didn't notice. In one evening, everything he thought was solid turned to dust. This is not the story of a genius investor. Not the story of a lucky lottery winner. Not a fairy tale startup miracle. This is the story of a man who lost everything in the worst financial collapse of a generation and somehow, years later, built a fortune no one believed was possible. But at that moment, he was just another casualty of a broken system. He had done everything right. Good grades, respectable university, long hours in finance, carefully climbed promotions, a mortgage, a car on payments, a modest investment portfolio. He believed in stability. He believed in institutions. He believed the system rewarded those who played by its rules, until the rules evaporated overnight. The next morning, he put on the same suit anyway, not because he had somewhere to go, but because he didn't know what else to do. He walked the same route to the train station, coffee in hand, pretending this was still his life, pretending the world hadn't shifted beneath his feet. At the station, he stopped, watched trains come and go, watched people rush to offices he no longer belonged to. And for the first time since he was a teenager, he had no plan. Weeks passed, then months. His savings drained quietly, like water leaking from a cracked pipe. Rent, food, bills, minimum payments, each withdrawal smaller than the last. Each number on his bank app a reminder that time was running out. He sent resumes. Hundreds, no response, no interviews, no callbacks. Friends stopped asking how he was doing, not out of cruelty, but because no one knew what to say to a man whose identity had evaporated. His wife tried to stay hopeful, but hope has a sound too. And slowly it changed. Her laughter grew thinner, her questions more urgent, her sleep restless. One night, after another argument about money, she left, packed a suitcase. Not all her things, just enough to say she might not return. The door closed softly behind her. He sat alone in the apartment, surrounded by furniture bought on credit he could no longer pay. A home that no longer felt like a home. A life that felt borrowed from someone who used to exist. For the first time, the thought came quietly. What if this is it? Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a slow realization that the story might end here. Another name in a long list of people swallowed by a crisis bigger than any individual. But something strange happens when a man reaches the edge. There's nothing left to lose. And in that emptiness, something new can enter. One morning, with only a few $100s left, he walked into a public library. Not to apply for jobs, not to read newspapers filled with bad news, but because it was warm, and quiet, and free. He wandered through aisles until he found himself in the business section. Shelves of books with gold lettering and confident titles. Books written by people who seemed to speak another language. Investing, entrepreneurship, leverage, assets, systems. He pulled one at random. Then another, then another. For hours, he read. Not skimming. Absorbing. Hungry in a way he had never been in school. Because now the stakes were real. This was not theory. This was survival. He began coming every day, opening to closing, reading everything. Biographies of business founders, histories of financial crises, books about markets, books about psychology, books about failure. Slowly, a realization formed. He had trusted the system to take care of him, but the system had no obligation to do so. If he wanted stability, he would have to build it himself. At first, the idea felt ridiculous. He had no money, no connections, no advantage, just a failing bank account and a bruised ego. But he had time, and he had focus, and a growing understanding of something most people never see. Money is not earned the way we are taught. It is structured, engineered, moved. He started small, embarrassingly small. He sold his car, canceled everything non-essential, moved into a cheaper apartment, took temporary work, anything to stay afloat. At night, he experimented, online marketplaces, tiny services, freelance gigs, reselling items, digital products, everything that didn't require upfront capital. Most failed. One online store made 3 sales in a month. Another lost money. A service business got one client who never paid. But unlike the corporate world he came from, failure here was information, not a termination letter. Just data. He adjusted, tried again, failed again, learned again. Months turned into a year. The apartment grew emptier, but his understanding grew sharper. One evening, he discovered something most people ignore: a boring, unglamorous business model. Low margins, no excitement, no headlines, but one critical detail. It solved a real problem for real people, consistently. He built a tiny version of it, just enough to test. No fancy website, no branding, just a simple offer sent to a handful of potential customers. The first payment came through at 2:17 a.m. He stared at the notification. $10. Not impressive, not life-changing, but different from anything before. This money did not come from an employer, not from a boss, not from a system. It came because he built something that created value. He slept that night for the first time in months. Over the next year, he repeated the process. Build, test, adjust, improve, expand. $10 became 50. 50 became 100. 100 became 1,000. Still modest, still fragile, but real. Then came the second shift. He realized he was trading time for money again, just in a different way. And time, he now knew, was the only asset that never replenished. So he built systems, automated parts of the process, outsourced tiny tasks, simplified operations, removed himself from the daily grind step by step. It was slow, painfully slow. Friends still saw him as the guy who never recovered from the crash. Family stopped asking about his career. Invitations to social gatherings faded away. But quietly, something was happening behind the scenes. The business grew, then another, then a third. Small streams, combined, compounding. Years passed. No sudden explosion, no overnight success, just relentless, invisible accumulation. And then, one day, he logged into his bank account and realized his monthly income exceeded his old corporate salary. He didn't celebrate, didn't tell anyone, just sat in silence, remembering the cracked glass in his hand years earlier. But he didn't stop, because the next realization came faster. If he could build one system, he could build another. He began investing again, not in blind trust this time, but with knowledge earned the hard way. He studied markets differently now, saw patterns others missed, recognized emotional cycles: fear, greed, panic, euphoria. He invested cautiously, then confidently, then strategically. A small portfolio grew, then a larger one, then diversified holdings, then ownership in companies, then real estate. A decade after the night the system collapsed around him, he walked into a bank office, not to ask for a loan, but to decline one. The banker spoke politely, nervously, respectfully, because now the numbers on paper told a different story. A story no one who knew him in 2008 would have believed. He owned businesses. He owned assets. He had liquidity. He had options. He left the office, stepped into the sunlight, and felt something unfamiliar. Not pride, not arrogance, freedom. Later that year, he bought a house. Not a symbol, not a trophy, but a place chosen because he liked the view. He furnished it simply. No gold faucets, no marble floors, just space, light, calm. On some evenings, he sat by the window and watched city lights flicker, the same lights he once watched from a collapsing life. Sometimes he thought about calling old colleagues. Sometimes he wondered where they ended up. Some recovered. Some didn't. Some never spoke of that time again. He never gave motivational speeches. Never wrote a best-selling book. Never posted luxury photos online. Most people would pass him on the street and never know the story behind his quiet walk, his unhurried steps, his calm eyes. But the transformation was real, not because he became rich, but because he rebuilt himself from nothing. He lost everything in the 2008 crash: his job, his identity, his marriage, his belief in the system. But in the ruins, he discovered something far more powerful: the ability to build his own system. And once a person learns that, no crash can take it away. Because the true fortune was never in the money. It was in understanding how the game actually works. And once you see it, you can never unsee it. The world still runs on cycles: boom, bust, fear, greed, collapse, recovery. But somewhere in a quiet house, a man who once held a broken glass in his bleeding hand watches it all unfold with a different expression now. Not fear. Clarity. Because the story that began with loss ended with control, and no one believed it was possible until it happened. He thought the story was over, that once he reached stability again, life would finally slow down, that the struggle had served its purpose, that the chapter of survival had closed. But stability has a strange effect on a mind that once lived in fear of losing everything. It doesn't create comfort. It creates vigilance. A quiet voice that whispers, "Don't let it happen again." And so he kept watching. Watching markets. Watching trends. Watching people's behavior around money. Not with panic, but with curiosity. With the calm precision of someone who had already seen the worst. In 2012, the world was healing. Banks were bigger. Markets were rising again. Headlines spoke of recovery. New technologies were emerging. Smartphones in every hand. Apps replacing institutions. A new generation trusting algorithms more than advisors. He noticed something most ignored. People still didn't understand money. They still trusted systems blindly. They still chased stability from employers who could vanish overnight. The same conditions that had broken him in 2008 were rebuilding, just in a new form. Only now, he saw it clearly. So he made another decision. A quiet one. No announcements. No dramatic gesture. Just a shift in direction. He started building not just businesses, but knowledge assets. Systems that educated. Tools that simplified finance for ordinary people. Services that helped small investors avoid the mistakes he once made. Nothing glamorous. Just practical, repeatable solutions. Once again, the first version was rough. Ugly interfaces, basic instructions, simple spreadsheets. But people used them. People needed them. And most importantly, people paid for them. He hired a part-time developer, then a designer, then a customer support assistant. Slowly, a real company formed. Not a startup chasing venture capital. Not a risky bet. A quiet machine, growing month by month. 5 years passed like this. No headlines. No hype. Just compounding. And then came a moment he would never forget. A journalist emailed him. They had found his company while researching financial education tools. They wanted an interview. A feature article. A short documentary segment. He almost declined. He didn't like attention. He didn't want to tell his story. He still carried a private superstition that speaking too loudly about success invited disaster. But he accepted. The camera crew arrived. Lights, microphones, questions. They asked about revenue, about growth, about mission, about impact. But then the interviewer asked something different. Where were you in 2008? The room went quiet. He paused. Not for drama, but because he remembered the cracked glass. The empty apartment, the train station, the library, The tiny $10 notification at 2:17 a.m. And he told them the story, not as a motivational lesson, not as a rags to riches tale, just facts, simple, honest, calm. The piece was released online a week later. It went viral. Comments flooded in. Messages from strangers. People who had lost jobs, lost savings, lost confidence. People who saw themselves in that broken man on a couch in 2008. But what struck him most wasn't praise. It was a single email from his ex-wife. "I saw the interview. I'm glad you made it." No bitterness. No blame. Just acknowledgement. He stared at the message for a long time, then closed the laptop and went for a walk. On that walk, he realized something important. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to banks, not to employers, not to society, not to anyone from his past. He had built a life that stood on its own foundation. Years rolled forward. His investments matured. His companies stabilized. His time freed up. He traveled, read, learned, mentored quietly, helped a few young entrepreneurs, donated anonymously to financial literacy programs. Never publicly, always quietly. And every so often, when markets shook again, a flash crash, a panic, a sudden dip, he would feel a familiar sensation, not fear, recognition, because he knew exactly how fragile systems could be, how quickly certainty dissolved, how fast crowds turned from confidence to chaos. But he also knew something else now. That collapse is not the end of a story. Sometimes, it is the beginning. One winter evening, many years after the crash, he visited the city where he once lost everything. He walked past the same station, the same platform, the same rushing crowd of people with places to go and jobs they believed were secure. He stood there for a while, unnoticed among them. Then he turned and left. No nostalgia, no sadness, just quiet gratitude for a version of himself that had survived long enough to see a different future. The world will always have crashes, always have bubbles, always have fear. But somewhere, in a quiet house with a simple view and a man who once had nothing, a different truth exists, that you can lose everything and still rebuild a life so strong, so quiet, so complete, that no one would believe it was born from ruins, unless they heard the story. And now, you have. The story could have ended there. A man rebuilt, a life restored, a quiet victory. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. Years after the viral interview, after the emails from strangers slowed, after the business settled into steady rhythm, something unexpected happened. The markets began to tremble again, not with the violence of 2008, not yet, but with subtle signs: rising debt, inflated valuations, new financial products no one fully understood, a generation of young investors pouring savings into assets they barely researched, headlines shouting optimism just a little too loudly. He watched all of it from a distance. He remembered how it felt to trust what everyone else trusted, and he recognized the pattern. One evening, he opened a chart on his screen, a familiar shape, a curve he had studied in books long ago, the same curve that preceded the crash that broke him. Only now he understood it from the inside. He adjusted his investments quietly, reduced exposure, increased cash reserves, strengthened business liquidity. Nothing dramatic, just precise movements, like a chess player moving pieces before the opponent sees the threat. Friends who knew a little about finance laughed. "Why are you being so cautious? Everything is going up." He smiled politely, said nothing. Let them believe the party would last forever. Because he remembered the night when television anchors said everything was fine, moments before everything collapsed. Then came 2020, a virus, a lockdown, global fear, markets collapsing in days instead of months, panic everywhere, people refreshing their phones in terror. He sat at his desk, calm, not emotionless, but prepared. His businesses shifted online instantly. His cash reserves allowed him to buy assets at prices he once could only dream of. While others sold in fear, he bought in discipline. While others froze, he acted, not out of greed, out of understanding. Months later, When markets recovered faster than anyone expected, his net worth had multiplied again. Not doubled. Multiplied. He didn't post about it, didn't announce it, didn't change his lifestyle, but one morning, while reviewing numbers, he realized something quietly astonishing. If he stopped working completely, his systems would still generate enough income to sustain him for life. The thought landed softly. No fireworks. No applause. Just a long breath. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. Birds on a wire. Wind moving leaves. Ordinary life continuing. And he realized the most unbelievable part of the story wasn't the money. It was the peace. Because the fear that once followed him, the fear of losing everything, had dissolved. Not because he was invincible, but because he knew, in his bones, that even if everything vanished again, he could rebuild. That knowledge was his real fortune. Years later, a young man would sit across from him in a small cafe. Nervous, ambitious, eyes burning with the same hunger he once carried into that public library. The young man asked, "What's the secret?" He stirred his coffee slowly, thought for a moment, then answered simply, "Nothing about money is magic. It's just understanding systems and refusing to quit when they fail you." The young man nodded, wrote it down, left inspired. He never followed up, never checked what happened to that stranger, because he knew the story could only be lived, not given. On certain nights, he still remembers the cracked glass, the blood in his palm, the silence of an apartment he could no longer afford, the echo of a phone call that ended his old life. He doesn't regret it, because without that collapse, he would have remained asleep inside a system he never understood. Sometimes destruction is a doorway. The world still spins. Markets still rise and fall. People still believe stability is permanent. And somewhere, someone is losing everything at this very moment. But somewhere else, a man who once had nothing sits in quiet comfort, not rich in display, but rich in control over his time, his choices, his peace. He never became famous. He never became legendary. He never became a headline. But he became free. And that is a fortune no one can take. Not a crash, not a crisis, not a system, because the greatest wealth he ever built was himself. And once a person understands that, the story never truly ends. The years that followed were quieter than any chapter before. No chaos, no collapse, no desperate nights counting the last dollars. Just rhythm. Morning sunlight through thin curtains. Coffee brewed slowly. A laptop opened not out of obligation, but curiosity. Messages from teams running systems he had designed years ago. Reports that arrived without urgency. Numbers that moved steadily, predictably, almost peacefully. He had reached what most people imagined was the end goal. Financial independence, control of time, freedom of choice. Yet something inside him remained alert, not anxious, aware. Because when a person has watched their entire world dissolve once, they never again believe in permanence. They believe in motion, cycles, fragility, adaptation. He spent more time reading than working now. Economics, psychology, history, ancient collapses, empires that believed they were eternal, traders who thought they were invincible, nations that ignored warning signs until it was too late, patterns repeated across centuries. Only the costumes changed. He realized something profound. The crash of 2008 wasn't a rare accident. It was one note in a long composition, and understanding that composition was the closest thing to power a human could possess. One evening, while walking through a quiet park, he passed a group of young professionals sitting on benches. Suits, phones, stock apps open, laughing about gains, speaking confidently about markets that only go up. He didn't interrupt them, didn't warn them, didn't preach. He simply walked by, a ghost of a future they couldn't yet imagine, because some lessons cannot be taught. They must be lived. Time continued. His businesses matured to the point that he sold one. Then another, not out of necessity, but choice. He invested in simple, durable assets, things that produced, things that endured. Nothing flashy, nothing fragile. He moved to a smaller home, not because he needed to, but because he no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. A quiet place, Bookshelves, a desk, a garden. He learned to cook, learned to play an instrument badly, learned to enjoy silence. Wealth gave him what he once thought money was for, not consumption, but space. Space to think, space to observe, space to exist without pressure. And in that space, he reflected often on the man he used to be, the man who believed a job title was identity, the man who believed institutions were solid, the man who believed stability was promised. He didn't judge that younger self. He felt compassion for him. A man doing what society taught him to do. A man unaware of the invisible forces shaping his fate. One rainy afternoon, he opened an old email archive, found the termination message from 2008. The subject line still there. Cold, formal, impersonal. He read it again, then deleted it, not ceremoniously, not emotionally, just a click, because he no longer carried that moment as trauma. It had transformed into origin. Years later, a new crisis came. Different cause, different headlines, different panic, but the same human behavior. The same fear, the same denial, the same desperate search for certainty. People rushed again, sold again, blamed again, cursed the system again, and again he moved quietly, methodically, without emotion, without urgency, not because he knew everything, but because he knew enough to remain calm while others shook. His wealth grew again, but more importantly, his stability remained untouched. He had built a structure that didn't depend on any single market, any single employer, any single system, a life composed of diversified foundations, financial, mental, emotional. That was the real architecture, not money. Structure. One morning, he received another email from a stranger. I lost everything this year. I saw your interview from years ago. I just wanted to say thank you. It made me believe rebuilding is possible. He stared at the message, and for the first time in many years, he remembered the taste of hopelessness, the weight of silence in an empty apartment, the sound of a cracked glass. He replied with a single sentence: start small, stay alive, stay curious. No emojis, no motivation, just truth. Because he knew the real story was not about becoming rich, it was about refusing to disappear. As decades passed, his hair grayed, his pace slowed, his eyesight softened, but his mind remained sharp, observant, awake. He traveled less, spoke less, owned less, needed less, and yet he had more than ever: time, autonomy, peace. On one particular evening, long after the world had forgotten the crash of 2008, he sat outside watching the sky darken. The air was cool, the garden quiet, the house behind him warm. He thought of the millions who would never tell their stories, the ones who lost everything and never rebuilt, the ones who carried shame quietly, the ones who believed failure defined them. He whispered, almost to no one, I was lucky. Not lucky because he made money. Lucky because he didn't stop moving when everything collapsed. Lucky because he walked into a library instead of giving up. Lucky because he stayed alive long enough to see a different version of himself. A breeze moved through the trees, and he closed his eyes, feeling the rarest form of wealth any human can experience. Not excitement, not ambition, not greed, but quiet, complete acceptance of life as it is, a life that began with a crash and became a freedom no one believed was possible, until it was lived. He stared at the headline, Severe Market Volatility Expected This Week. He exhaled softly and locked the phone. Years ago, that sentence would have made his pulse race. His mind would spiral. His body would tighten. His future would feel fragile. Now, it was just information. Weather, a change in wind direction. He sipped his coffee and watched the sky brighten slowly, like a curtain lifting on a familiar stage. Inside the house, a clock ticked quietly. No urgency, no threat, just time passing exactly as it should. Later that morning, he opened his laptop. Messages from his team confirmed everything was running. Systems stable, cash reserves healthy, clients calm, automated strategies already adjusted to new conditions. He didn't need to act. That was the strangest part of the life he had built. He used to believe success meant constant movement, constant control, constant effort. But real power, he learned, was designing a machine so resilient that it worked without him. He closed the laptop and decided to walk. On the street, people hurried, phones in hands, voices anxious, news anchors speaking of uncertainty, fear spreading again, invisible but familiar. He passed a cafe and saw a young woman staring at a stock app, her face pale. A young man pacing outside, arguing loudly into his phone. A group of friends debating what to sell before it gets worse. He recognized every expression, every tone, every trembling certainty. He kept walking, not because he didn't care, but because he knew each person must cross their own bridge. No one can carry another across the river of realization. In the park, he sat on a bench beneath a tree. Leaves moved gently in the wind. Children played without any awareness of interest rates, inflation, or market cycles. Life, pure and indifferent to human systems. He smiled. He remembered being one of those children once. Before money became meaning, before status became identity, before stability became an illusion, he stayed there a long time, just observing. Then his phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't recognize. "Sir, you don't know me. I watched the documentary about you years ago. I just wanted to say, I lost everything last year. I was close to giving up, but your story kept me going. I started rebuilding. It's slow, but I'm alive. Thank you." He stared at the words, no emojis, no exaggeration, just truth. He typed a reply, "I'm glad you stayed." He didn't add advice, didn't add motivation, didn't add philosophy. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer is recognition. That night, he sat by his window again. The city lights shimmered like they had on the night of the crash. Same lights, same world, different man. He thought about how strange time was, how a single phone call could destroy a life, how a single decision, to walk into a library instead of surrender, could rebuild one. He thought about how most people never realize the moment their life changes until long after it has passed. He closed his eyes, and for a brief moment, he saw the younger version of himself, sitting on a couch, bleeding palm, broken glass, television screaming disaster. A man who believed his story had ended. He whispered softly, almost with gratitude, "You had no idea what was coming." The wind touched the curtains. The room breathed quietly around him. The world outside continued its endless cycles. Markets rising, markets falling. Fear, hope, collapse, renewal. But inside that small house, a man who once lost everything sat in calm certainty. Not because he had beaten the system, but because he had stepped outside of needing it to feel safe. He didn't know how many years he had left. No one ever does, but he knew this. If everything disappeared tomorrow, money, assets, companies, markets, he would still wake up, still think clearly, still adapt, still build, still live, because the real fortune he had created was not measured in currency. It was measured in the quiet confidence of a man who had already survived the worst night of his life and discovered the morning on the other side. And somewhere, as the screen fades to black, a final line lingers in the narrator's voice. He lost everything in the crash and built a life no collapse could ever take away.